Hello, and welcome back to the Creative Resistance Podcast. I'm Scott Cassidy, and each episode finds me chatting to the artists, activists, and thinkers who refuse to look away. Now, this episode is one that aligns perfectly with the ethos of the creative resistance, and it's for conversations like this that I started the podcast in the first place. So I'll be speaking to Cat Cochrane. Cat is a writer, journalist and performance poet from Glasgow. Dipping in and out of the west of Scotland patois, her storytelling delves into working class dreams and sensibilities. She has 2 published books of short stories and poems titled Sugartown and Sweet Teas. Cat is currently working on a new book and photography project titled Glasgow Hairdressers and Barbers' Tales, and is producer and host of No Dice, an audio podcast series covering stories of female gambling, addiction and journeys of recovery across Scotland. Now currently available on Spotify and linked to in the show notes. And in this episode, we dive deep into Cat's own creative journey, her own journey of recovery, and we explore the advocacy work that she does in a world turned upside down. I hope you enjoy the episode. Cat Cochrane, very welcome to the Creative Resistance Podcast, very first guest of 2026. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks, Scott, for having me. Yeah, it's we found ourselves in a day where it's absolutely blowing a hoolie outside, but that's what to expect in the final days of January, or the final 69 days of January. But I'm doing well, thank you, and it's great to be chatting to you today.
Grand. Yeah, you've beat me to it there. I was just about to say we're on opposite sides of the country, but the weather's equally grim here. So I'm hoping it doesn't come through on the mic, but if it does, apologies to the listeners. So yeah, huge thank you for joining, Kat. Just going to get stuck straight into it. So pretty sure our paths first crossed as writers kicking about kind of on Instagram, at events, throughout the sort of Scottish poetry scene, writing scene, and I first knew you as a poet. But after we've had a little bit of chat recently, I now know that you started writing in response to being in rehab in 2022. So before we dig into sort of creativity, writing and how all that came about, do you mind sharing a little bit about your story around gambling?
Yeah, no worries, Scott. So I guess going back to the kind of first experience that I recall of any note with gambling was when I was 18, and my mum asked me to pop into the bookies to put on an each way bet in the Grand National, that's quite an innocuous thing, but quite a common thing, I guess. And so I remember going in and actually feeling quite comfortable in the space, even though it was all full of men. It was like you were able to smoke in those days in bookies, and they were smoke filled. And I remember going in and being convinced that even in that early experience, that I was coming back in again to pick up my wins, or I'd put a bet on. My mum had put my mum's bet on, and I was convinced that was kind of how it worked. And looking back, just how comfortable I was in there, but I don't really remember anything else apart from that. And I certainly didn't grow up in a family of gamblers or anything like that. But I went away in my 20s, travelled for like I say, most of my 20s, kind of islands, Australia, New Zealand, lived in Isle of Man for a while. And in all those years I wasn't really touched by gambling, probably because I was being so busy and fitting into a week what you would do in a month here, and just grabbing life, in your 20s. So, but what happened was I came back to Glasgow to settle after I'd done all my holiday visas, and I'd kind of overstayed my welcome in a few places, and I found myself really restless. I grew up in East Kilbride, and there was no way I was moving back to East Kilbride, so I'd kind of got a flat in Glasgow, but I was finding it hard to settle, still had the itchy feet, and therefore I found myself gravitating back into the bookies again, just as a bit of escapism. And I remember thinking a lot of women wouldn't, because I wouldn't say to my pals, come on at the bookies for a night or an afternoon, but it was something I would do just myself. And I actually loved it, because I remember it was all about hearing the pattern. There's a lot of life in bookies, and in a way, it was as a writer, it was a great place to kind of hang out. I wasn't actually writing in earnest then. I was just thinking of myself as a writer. It was kind of like this far off thing, because I had other issues to deal with and things to get through. So gambling was kind of secondary, but so I would just sort of bet on like horses and the football and everything. And then along came online gambling, which kind of feel, looking back, is like low hanging fruit for me at the time. I remember having an account in 2012, and online gambling hadn't really taken off then, and there was a lot of people who were kind of younger. I didn't want to go into the bookies because it was full of old men, but it was a natural progression just to move on to the, smartphones had probably only really been getting big then. It'd been maybe now for a couple of years. So this idea of having like a bookies in your pocket 24/7 seemed quite appealing. Yeah, and for that it was just like putting on the odd bet, accumulators. But the thing that gambling sites do, and they did even in those days, is to try and entice you to play slots, roulette, blackjack, by offering free games and free spins. And I did fall for that. I put my hands up and I did fall for that, because I'm the kind of person where if there's bells and whistles, my head pops up for a bit of the action. So for a few years I was kind of floating around in and out of that, and I went to college to study practical journalism, and that kind of kept me out of trouble a wee bit, because obviously I was focusing on learning something, and I ended up qualifying, was Scottish Student Journalist of the Year. I was kind of headhunted, because they'll come after you because they think that you've got something and all that sort of thing. So I didn't want to work in newsrooms, but I ended up in a newsroom, local newspaper in Glasgow, and I found it toxic. Found it absolutely toxic. Really didn't like it. Being a sort of working class woman, I just felt like I don't know, there was barriers, and it's hard to explain, but it happened, and I found myself gravitating back into gambling. Was going to the casino a bit more. I can remember days when my editor was phoning me, but I was sitting at the roulette wheel, the electronic roulette wheel and bookies and things, and FOBTs were a big thing then. So sorry, I lost my pot there.
No, it's fascinating what you were saying there about that kind of like progression as well, from that initial bet, nothing for years. And then I thought one thing that really struck me there was that you were talking about like the bookies. There was people in there with good patter, there was the kind of stories, and there was a sort of almost a culture and a feeling of being accepted, which is maybe at odds with what you then felt in the workplace when you maybe didn't feel like you slotted in. I think that was quite an interesting 2 points within that same spiel there about a feeling of acceptance and a feeling not. I'm quite intrigued about the transition from being in a physical place, so like being in the bookies, being in the casino, to being predominantly online, because obviously that takes away the kind of the culture, the chatting to people, the stories you're hearing. Was that a sign of that, therefore, that kind of getting worse, getting more serious, and it being about the gambling rather than the actual environment you were in?
Yeah, so the good thing, I mean, I kind of look at it back at and go, there was a reason why I spent that amount of time in bookies, is because I was able to get a lot of stories out of it, which have ended up in books that I wrote later, and characters. I was able to amalgamate a lot of characters that I met in bookies. And of course, you won't get that on online gambling. They have, like, say, for example, if you join bingo sites, they've got a sidebar that's kind of like a community, and it's like hiya, and I'm convinced that the majority of them are just chatbots to keep you going, and that's what it's designed. That's another thing that the gambling firms do to kind of keep people playing, because they're made to feel part of a community, because a lot of gambling, which we'll talk about later, is down to isolation, which keeps you going. So, but the thing is that obviously when you at some point the bookies closes. At some point, even though they get long license hours, the casino closes. But when you've got something 365 days, 24 hours a day on your phone or on your laptop or on your any electrical device in your home or anywhere, you can be playing it, you can be doing it anytime. I mean, the amount of times I was like, I remember like having a shower and I was like, my hand was hanging out, like playing roulette, that kind of thing, because it's just, it gets you like that. Staying up to like 4 a.m. or going to bed when my partner was going to work, that kind of thing, like ships in the night. You lose a lot. It's not just about the money. You use a lot of time. You lose a lot of time on gambling, especially online gambling, because like I say, when it comes down to the bookies, you can walk out because it might be the door shuts behind you at 10 o'clock, but so it has two different experiences.
Yeah. Was there a tipping point when like you realised that you'd moved into that problem area, or was there like a period of time where you kind of lied to yourself as much as anything else?
Yeah, so what actually happened was I got out of the newsroom, but my timing was lousy because I had intention of leaving there, but staying on being a community reporter, but doing it in my own way. And the reason why my timing was lousy was because it was 2 months before COVID hit. And the thing about lockdown is it kind of provided like the perfect breeding ground and the perfect storm situation, because there's three things that a gambler needs, and that's money, time, and access. And of course, COVID and lockdown provided all of those things until the money runs out, but definitely the time and access. So yeah, my gambling definitely accelerated during lockdown. I think I'd passed. There's a thing we talk about in recovery, and it's when you cross the invisible line, and you can't always see it when it's happening, but when you're in recovery, you're able to maybe place that in your own personal timeline. So during lockdown, I was doing crazy things to procure money because the gambling had really got out of hand. I was selling belongings. There's things that I did during that period that I'm really ashamed of, and I still need to, sort of figure out in my head how to heal from that. And sometimes a decent wins, because the decent wins sort of make you go, aye, all right, I'm good at this. And then that should have been enough for anybody, and I should have been able to walk away, but I ended up putting every single penny back in, and it was a vicious cycle. And yeah, so I would stay up all night. My partner wouldn't see me, I'd lose track of time. So it all came to a head in September 2021, when really I'd kind of ran out of road when it came to the ducking and the diving. And it was my partner's birthday, and we're sitting having a meal, and I'm thinking, and this happened quite a lot of times, but this was really the worst one. I'm thinking, I've got £60 in my account and a bit of cash in my pocket. I've got enough for this meal. And then I went to check my, like online banking, and then I was like, I realised, Kat, you spent that last night at midnight, and I didn't have a penny in my account. So I had to come clean about that, and therefore I had to come clean about everything that had been going on. And my partner had a good idea of what had been going on, but not to the extent, not to the extent. So basically, it was kind of like, yeah, I'll support you mentally, financially even, emotionally, but you have to go and get help. So that was a Sunday, and then by the Tuesday evening, I was in my first GA meeting, and that was there's a wee story I tell about that. Is it was in Tory Glen, and it was in a kind of church setting, and on it's like a Tuesday night, so it was on the one side of the room, or one side of the building, sorry, was choir singing, and on the right hand side of the room there was the GA meeting. And I walked
Gamblers
in.
Anonymous, yeah.
Gamblers Anonymous. Sorry, Gamblers Anonymous GA, yeah. And I took two steps in, and I sort of messaged ahead. So I thought, I'm coming. You know what I mean? You don't want to announce it, but you sort of like make sure that it's okay. And my partner was actually able to come in the first meeting, because that's like a sense of support. Because a lot of people might not get through the door if they don't just have that wee bit of support. Yeah. So anyway, I took my first step in, and this wee guy shot his hand up and went, "Here, hen, I think you're in the wrong room. The choir singing's across there." And I just took like a couple of steps further into the room and went, "No, mate, I think you'll find I'm in the right room." So. And that was a kind of little snippet of what it's like being a woman, because obviously when I would go into the bookies all those years, it would kind of be like, oh, like that's a bit unusual. I mean, not that unusual, but a wee bit unusual.
Yeah.
And then there I'm stepping into another male-dominated space, and I'm getting a similar reaction, but I was in a better space.
That must have made it harder though, did it? To like take that step? Did you feel was there a stigma that came with that? Did you feel it as a barrier?
The guys were great with me, to be honest. There was a couple of women in there. I wasn't the only woman. It was one of the organisers was female. She's great. But yeah, I mean, you could go to meetings and it would be like 38 guys and 2 women, and I was one of them. I didn't find it. The only time that I found it difficult is that like I would maybe want to talk about something like or get it or try and even process if when I gambled, was it to do with hormones? Was it to do with time of the month? Was it to do with certain things that and men obviously don't ever have to think about that.
Yeah.
So I was never really, I never really thought it was like something they would want to hear or something they would want to listen to or whatever. So I always kept stum about that, but that was going on in my mind for a while. So things like that, and then there was maybe things that they would say that was very much through a male lens, and I couldn't identify with them because but at the end of the day, we're all there for the same reason. So we did, I did find tribe to an extent, but yeah. So that's first
it's amazing that these things are out there though, for sure. And then am I right in saying so that you went to GA, but there was a sort of residential stay of rehab as well, wasn't there, that followed that? How much later was that than this sort of 2021 moment?
Yeah, so 8 months I was going to GA for, and I was still gambling. And even though it was working certain ways, I was still gambling. And I was making that absolute fatal thing that nobody should ever do in GA, is that I was actually gambling and saying that I wasn't in the meetings. So this really was messing with my head. And then one day in February 2022, I woke up. I'd been able to accumulate a wee bit of money and put some money away. Just woke up and there was nothing stopping me, or nothing was going to stop me from going gambling that day. Not for any particular reason, just because I wanted to. So I ended up, I remember it was a Wednesday morning, it was about 11 o'clock in February day, and I ended up in the casino in the Riverside in Glasgow. I don't want to advertise or sponsor places, so I might let those slip, but just to give you a bit of context of where and when and that. Ended up in front of one of the roulette machines, and I basically lost £500 in like 10 minutes.
Wow.
And I was like, shit, how am I going to explain this to my partner, my mum, my best friends, everybody that was, because as far as I was concerned, they all thought I was in a good place, but I wasn't really, because there's something missing from the support there, So I remember going home and crying into my pillow that night, because I thought, this is a rock bottom. There's been a few rock bottoms, but this is a really sort of like, this isn't working with. So I Googled, I think the next morning, like gambling rehab or gambling, like some sort of intense support. And basically I couldn't find anything in Scotland. So I ended up having to go down to a charity support rehab in England. It was in Birmingham, called Gordon Moody, who are a fantastic company, a fantastic charity rather.
That's mad though, isn't it, that you couldn't find, even actively seeking it, you couldn't find anything closer to home.
I actually remember when I did Google it the first time, I think one of the things that came up was like the Priory, and they don't specialise in gambling, and then it's something like $2,000 a week or $2,000, something ridiculous to even just like get your foot in the door. And somebody struggling with gambling is not going to have anywhere near that amount of money, and they're not going to beg, steal and borrow to get it either, because they've had a history of beg, steal and borrow for so the trust issues and things like that. So I went down to rehab, and I was in rehab for 6 weeks. With a group of women, and it was fantastic because I had a one-to-one therapist, and even though obviously with gambling as an addiction you lose, there's a lot of mental health that deteriorates. There's a lot of like obviously financial debt, things that play, like trouble you've got yourself into. And but the one thing that my therapist Davina saw in me that I was struggling with at my soul was that I'd lost my creativity, because I had total writer's block for about going on nearly 2 years while I was gambling, maybe for about a year and a half. Hadn't done that community journalism, had been writing wee things here and there, wee kind of bits in notebooks, but nothing concrete. Promised myself that I would finish that story, that I would, like poems and things like that, just snippets floating about. And she says, right, Cat, like you set yourself a challenge, write something in the 6 weeks that you're here. And I went, okay, I will. And it was it gave me space to, do that. And then what happened was, on the final day, we were all leaving and we're all giving a wee speech and stuff. And Davina said, do you fancy reading out what you've written? And I was like, oh, I don't know. It's, it's very, and I thought, oh, bugger it, why not? So I stood up and I had the notebook right up to my nose. It was like I didn't want anyone to see my face. Did this poem that I'd written, and it was called "A Future, Not What It Used to Be." and it was about my past, and it was about my present, and it was a bit about my future, and it was also some of the included some lines had included some of the women that were also in the cohort, and put my notebook down, and there was like tears, and I just thought, oh, I didn't expect that, and they were like, because it was like maybe in the 6 weeks nobody'd really seen the essence of me, because you can give so much, but but through this poem, it was like I was gaining my soul, and then so that was a very cathartic moment.
It's a really beautiful moment in what sounds like a really dark time as well. Yeah, incredible. So when we were chatting before the podcast, when we were going sort of back and forward on email, you said that recovery process rewired your brain, which I think is incredible. But I'm really keen to know whether you see it as the poetry was a result of that rewiring, so that refound creativity. Did that come because your brain had been rewired, or was the act of writing actually the tool that you used and therefore part of the rewiring process? Yeah, how was that for you?
Yeah, my brain was definitely rewired, Scott, in terms of I started to see gambling, started to personifying gambling, if that makes sense, by thinking of it as a person who, like, imagine it as a relationship. Like, would I let a person treat me the way that gambling's treated me? And the answer would always be no. So that I always keep that at the core. And as soon as that like landed into my brain, I saw everything sort of differently, because then I was able to have boundaries with it. And within those boundaries, that I promised myself that I would be more creative. So because of the tools that I'd learned in rehab, I came out feeling refreshed, feeling that I had a lot to, I'd always had a lot to say, but I had a lot to say, and therefore I was putting pen to paper. I was definitely so my goal, one of the goals that I had, was to have a book written and published within a year of leaving rehab, or within that 12 months, and I did that. So I had to write it. I had to like sit down and go, what have I got to say? Gather all those little notebooks from over the years, all those wee sort of like things that you've got in a file in your Google Drive or in your Dropbox over the years. Put all this together in a concerted effort to get this published and out, and that was, and as soon as I started writing, I went, this is a bigger buzz than gambling. Who knew?
That's brilliant.
Who knew? If only I'd known that, but it's part of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's amazing. I love the way that you're writing and the way you perform. Actually, it sort of celebrates working class life, telling stories that need to be told with brilliant narrators and characters. And it made me think of one of my absolute favourite poems. It's a tiny poem by Graham Fulton, who I think is a Paisley-based poet. Do you know Graham? I don't know if you do. I don't know him.
I don't, but I know his work.
Yeah, I know some people
his
do.
work,
And but all accounts a good guy. But the tiny poem, I'll just read it because it's so short. It's called The Optimist. It goes, in the corner of the bookies' doorway, trying to light his fag in the storm. And that's it, which I think says so much, and it totally struck a chord with me when I was reading your story. Which is amazing. And I think I know that guy that's in that story. I think we all know the guy that he's talking about. And it made me think, like, gambling's sort of always packaged as sort of the underdog's way out, and that kind of thing we spoke about before, about there being a sort of strong culture, a storytelling, a sense of belonging for some people. And I just would like to know more about what you felt about the gambling industry sort of targeting of specific demographics.
Yeah. Can I say, first of all, I've always felt like the underdog because I'm gay, ginger, and left-handed. So it's like I've always felt slightly out, like on the outside on numerous occasions in my life. But in terms of the gambling industry, so for years, the gambling industry focused solely on men. That it was betting was a male pursuit, and women went to bingo. I know that sounds so generalised, but that is how it kind of worked, and they didn't have to really think about that.
That's how it was growing up, wasn't it? Back in the day,
exactly. 100%. Like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that's the way it was for a long time, for generations, kind of way. But in the last 10 years, and certainly since COVID, and it's like I keep bringing COVID back, but it is quite a kind of like, it's a tipping point in a lot of things. But so COVID and the lockdown, I think, and especially in the cost of living, like kind of post-COVID, the industry has definitely made concise campaign to target women. So as an example, and this is actually in total plain sight. So if you're to watch like STV during the week, during the day, all those shows like Loose Women, like that, for example, is sponsored by bingo companies. The quiz shows that are on in the afternoon, they're all sponsored by gambling firms. And then in between, you've got the online bingo ads and the in-programme competitions that you need to pay like £2 to enter. So that's gambling. People don't see that as gambling. It is so some people don't see bingo as gambling, you know, but it is gambling because you are laying something to get, you know, risk and reward. But all those things are the dopamine hits, you know, all those things are there. So that, you know, so there you've got a whole sort of like mainstream media channel for that whole time. And obviously they're targeting women because it's, you know, they're coming back from the school run and watching programs like that, or women are carers, so they've maybe got TV on the background, and you know, it's like there is a reason why they do it. It's no coincidence. Another demographic that's definitely targeted by the industry is LGBT community. Gambling companies are after, I guess, what we all know is like the pink pound, and therefore there's a demographic of, you know, there's like male men who do have like more disposable income than say other demographics. There's a lot of young trans men and women who are kind of experience social isolation and are more at risk of self-harm, and gambling can start as a means of escapism, and that can lead to harm within that. And there's also less chance that members of the LGBT community will reach out for help, because of that fear that there's not quite enough safe spaces for them to do that, and therefore compulsive gambling can go on for a lot longer than it should, without, you know, support due to that. A pal was actually telling me not that long ago that there's a lot of gambling ads on Grindr, and I thought, why is that? And he's like, well, you know, because a lot of men go on with, shall we say, you know, quote unquote impulsive thoughts, or in a, you know, a certain impulsive mood. So, and I thought, right enough, you know, that's another wee, you know, sort of thing.
It's such
you know.
specific targeting though, isn't it? Like it's so manipulative. Like, so
Yep.
yeah.
But the thing, and also people with like ADHD, you know, if you think about like spinning wheels, that's like a magnet to somebody with ADHD, like that immediate gambling where it's like something spins result, you know, like if you get ADHD, that somehow is a comfort. I don't know, it's a weird thing to say, but so there is some research going on to sort of like try and correlate those two. But I think the thing, sorry, Scott.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt there, Kat. I was just going to say that a lot of people with ADHD and other sort of neurodivergence as well are there's a predisposition there for all kinds of addiction. And actually, you're right, that I'd never really thought about it before, but how that specific type of buzz that gambling instills, hugely risky.
It's like, say, for somebody with ADHD, like putting on a football bet and having to wait 90 minutes for the result, that might not quite have the same effect, you know, or the same sort of like dopamine hit as what, you know, spinning wheels would have. But the thing is, and this is the one that I feel that we all need to be aware of, is kids, because there's such a rise of, it's been around for a while, but it's on the rise. It's like what I call the kind of gamblification of gaming, with young people involved. So you just need to look at like loot boxes and, you know, the awards, the rewards you get in FIFA and skins in various games. So that kind of gameplay is akin to the same dopamine hit that pings when you are playing online slots. So if you imagine like 9, 10, 11-year-olds, and with the permission of their parents, not realising what's kind of going on in the brain, that's what they are experiencing, you know, and been experiencing for a while, and that's a kind of gateway into, you know, being an adult and then being able to have legally like online gambling accounts and things like that. You know, it's kind of a little bit like, you know, they say like hash or whatever, marijuana is like a gateway drug to thingy. I don't know if I want to correlate it exactly the same way, but you know what I mean? It's an entry into a world of gambling that's kind of acceptable and legal, of course, you know. So
it's also a follow-on from an addiction that I think most of us probably have, that addiction to your phone. Do you know what I mean? Like, kids are so glued into their phone, and actually, if they're gaming on the phone, the logical next step, I hadn't even thought about that before, could well be a kind of dipping their toe into gambling, and before you know it, it's huge, isn't it? So
yeah.
I Amazing.
And they know it. They know it. The gambling industry knows exactly what they're doing.
Totally. The next, you've kind of covered what I was going to ask about next, which was about
Mhm.
the kind of dark arts that they're using, which I think is it's Machiavellian, isn't it? It's that kind of really getting their hooks into people in any way they can. But I
Mhm.
know that, since your journey, like, you do a lot of advocacy work. You've had your podcast, the No Dice podcast, and I'll put some links up into the show notes about that.
Thank
And
you.
then, excuse my pronunciation, but what's the organisation? Is it Ayla you're doing some work
Ayla,
with?
yeah. So Ayla
Yeah.
is Gaelic for from a strong place. So it's kind of
Okay.
fitting, yeah, because it's like a female website, support website for women across Scotland who are experiencing their own gambling harm, and also for people who are experiencing harm from other people's gambling, compulsive gambling, be that partner, family member, whatever, friend, colleague as well. So yeah, it took a long time to come up with the Ayla because it was like flourishing
Uh-huh.
bells, blossoming, but it was all this kind of.
Yeah.
But Ayla, yeah, Ayla is Gaelic for that, and it's quite
So that's about
fitting.
direct support, and then you've got your things like this and other advocacy work that you're doing to kind
Mm.
of beat the drum and raise awareness as well.
Yeah, that's correct. So I was very fortunate with Ayla because what happened was Simon Community, who's a
Hmm.
predominantly a charity across Scotland that focus on homelessness, but they were starting to see the correlation between um, gambling and homelessness, and particularly female gambling and homelessness. So they got together with a web design company called Third Sector Lab, and they made a call out for people who are affected by gambling harm if they wanted to be part of a co-production, whereby we could all be together giving our expertise, them as a charity with the knowledge of what was going on in the statistics and how they already supported people. Third Sector Lab with our web design and knowledge around that, and myself and a group of women who were coming and saying that works, that doesn't, that's what you need, and I think that's the only way that these things can work is when you have that lived experience voice within it, or else it's just kind of like to me it won't work, and it won't be as effective because it
Yeah, it's
won't
just
people
noise and preaching.
exactly, because the end product won't be for the people that it's for.
Yeah.
That's because we always had it in mind. This is what I would have liked to have seen 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So therefore, you're wanting to pass on that to the future generation or women who are struggling and looking for somewhere to. There's no sort of central place for a woman to go. Because when I would, like I say, Scott, a few years ago, I was like, it's like, what's my options? GA, is that it? Whereas
Mhm.
there's so much on Ayla where you can be directed to various different like different nights that are specifically for women and in female spaces, where you can tell your story and you can be seen and you can share. Yeah, so that was a lovely experience, and then that kind of all the conversations that came out of that sort of like it helped to shape the idea of having a podcast, because I thought the female experience of gambling doesn't get picked up by the mainstream media. It doesn't even get picked up by any media. So you'd need to make your own documentary, or you'd need to have your own podcast series to really talk about these issues. And I had it in mind that the podcast would have a journey arc. So the first episode sort of lays the ground a little bit, and it's like why women gamble is different from why men gamble. That's the title of it. So that kind of gives the idea of the different experience. There's shame and stigma. There's support. There's an episode about support. We've got one specifically for LGBT, keeping safe in early days of recovery, and then it kind of follows down this journey arc coming down the other side, talking about really, kind of can we change the gambling industry from our perspective in some way through advocacy, what personal life. Sort of personal growth beyond gambling can look like, and then essentially what a gamble free life can look like, and talk to people who are living it. So it's kind of the dark stuff at the beginning of it that's necessary, and then it's like following that arc. And I've now finished the podcast. I've done 12 episodes, and any further ones that I do will be at the behest of people getting in touch and saying, I would love to talk about this, or I'd love to talk about that, and I'd love to do that.
Yeah,
because there's still so much more to talk about.
definitely. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Like, I listened to a good few episodes and will definitely go back and finish them in prepping for this. And I think that kind of narrative arc thing is so important because it shows your journey. But just like following up on a few of the key things that you said there, I think that sort of safe spaces coupled with lived experience, and then actually the
Mhm.
storytelling aspect of showing people that, look, I've been where you are, I've gone through it, I've gone
Mhm.
back to it, I've gone through it again, and I'm now here, I think is
Mhm.
hugely important. And there's a kind of something I've picked up on as we've been chatting in
Mhm.
lots of different ways, whether it was going originally into the bookies in the first place, whether it was finding and chatting to people at GA, whether it's going on to speak to people involved with charity work or podcast stuff. I think community has been a kind of
Mhm.
constant positive thread throughout all of that. And I know that we've spoken before about how, in poetry and performance poetry, to be precise, you sort of feel
Mhm.
that you found your tribe. So confronting addiction is one thing for everyone. I think it's a really brave thing that should be saluted for everyone,
Mhm.
but doing it publicly on a stage is another thing altogether.
Yeah.
Um, and I just wonder if that collective nature of that kind of world protects against isolation that's inflicted and imposed by gambling.
Yeah, well, what I would say is, well, you would and you wouldn't be surprised the amount of people that perform poetry to the extent where they actually call themselves performance poets,
Mm.
actually have experience with addiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I could definitely count on two hands people that, and without naming them, but they're very open about it as well. That have, and that's when I realised I found my tribe. Because I'd fall in love with poetry, try to get out of addiction, and then the two worlds collide.
Mm.
Or let's not get out of addiction, but live with it, live in recovery with it, and yeah, like for me, like if I do, like, say, performance poetry, like even on a wee rainy Tuesday night in January, the buzz I get from that is higher than anything I've ever got from gambling. And similar, I wouldn't have believed that was true. And and I think you can see that a lot in like poetry communities is like you see each other,
Mm.
even if you've got very, very different lives, it's like when you're in that room with an open mic going on or a poetry slam going on, or you're looking at, you've got a lot of respect for each other because you've got the opportunity to kind of be tribe and be tribe in a safe space. And I think when people stand up and perform poetry that they've written or words that they've written, whether you call it poetry or spoken word, I know there's a lot of kind of, not conflict, but people call it different things.
Yeah.
It's your way of telling the truth in a safe space, and I think it's like there's not a lot of safe spaces nowadays because we're all sort of meant to be categorized and put in these different holes, and we're not meant to congregate together. I'm convinced, so that those safe spaces are paramount to a lot of people's mental health and everything, and to their social well-being. And chances are, and this has happened to me, and it's happened to me on both sides. Like someone's come up to me, or I've went up to someone and said, "I see you because of those words that you stood up and said. I hear you, I see you. That resonates. I get it."
Mm.
And see that, Scott, that feeling is like the biggest buzz that
Yeah.
I could have in terms of creativity, in terms of what I try to do and take seriously, and I love it when I'm able to say that to somebody else and really mean, I wouldn't just say it to anybody and be giving them lip service. I'd be only doing that to somebody that I really truly go, aye, I know exactly what you're talking about, mate. And then you end up just talking more, and then you end up becoming friends, and it's beautiful.
It's
And
beautiful.
it's human connect. It's just all about human connection, isn't it?
Yeah. Totally agree. I think, firstly, I think in Glasgow especially, there's everywhere, but the Glasgow scene seems especially sort of inclusive and open.
Mhm.
I also think there's something about that environment. It's definitely not for everyone, but I think
Mhm.
everyone should give it a bash at some point because there's very few spaces in modern life where you are sitting and actively listening. And you might not enjoy everything you hear, but
Yeah.
it's a conversation, even though you're not speaking at the same time, because you're listening
Mhm.
to what someone's putting out there. You know they've worked on it, and then if you're also getting up and doing your bit, then they're listening to you. So it sparks a conversation that is much deeper
Mhm.
than a conversation with someone that you've just met in any other setting. I think so. I totally agree with what you're saying. That, it's just
Mhm.
a space that is safe, and I think it's a really brilliant thing that you found that and you found it to be positive. And I think you've helped people as well by doing that. So That's, yeah, all kudos to you, definitely.
Hmm.
I was reading some of your poems before we did this, and I think, firstly, love them. I think they're brilliant, and I sort of see your poetry
Thank
a
you.
bit like sort of guerrilla warfare against the juggernauts of the sort of gambling industry. Like, you're getting kind of, I think some of the characters you write about, I think some of the sort of the stories that you're telling are so important because they're capturing real life, and actually they're shining a light on the people that these big sort of industry types are trying to get their hooks into.
Mhm.
Um, and it made me think, like, it's one of the truest forms of creative resistance. I set this podcast up exactly to do that, to sort of show people who are using their creativity to resist things. And I think out of all the episodes I've done, this is probably the one that is the truest to that brief that I had in my head when I first started. Um, and I know that you're quite deliberately independent from any specific organisations, so that you can speak freely, you can say what you want, you can get your message across. How important is your creativity in how you do this? And more importantly, how important is your creativity to you as you navigate a life free of gambling?
Yeah, I think. Thank you. That was really kind what you just said there. It was really lovely. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I work better as a sole trader, a sole ninja, a lone wolfie. Yeah, I've not actually worked for any organisation since before COVID,
Mm.
and I quite like to keep it that way because it means that I'm not beholden to any organisation. I mean, sometimes I work with really brilliant charities, that are doing great work. And there's very individual people in there, and it's like, but they're still beholden. They've got to follow the not the company line, but the charity line, because they have a certain thing that they can't say. And I'm like,
Yeah,
oh, I just don't fancy that. I just, so I'm going to try and keep myself as independent as possible because that's the way my creativity works. It's the way that I'm able to be, because if I ended up just like with a full time job, working even in a job that I love, it would strip something away. Now, don't get me wrong, because that sounds very precious. Oh no, I don't fancy a full time job so I can fanny about doing poems, but I do take like the writing and the poetry and the performance and the message and the kind of sticking up for the wee guy and the things that I try to get across. I do take them seriously enough where I'm like, no, I want to carve out a life where I I can do that and still do things where I can pay the rent and I can pay the bills. And okay, I might have a headache with money and I might have certain, anxieties in life, but who doesn't? I'd rather be
yeah,
doing that independently. And I tell you something, like what I've realised is I've got to make a kind of got to take positive measures out of addiction because you probably know yourself, like when you have lived experience of something that's kind of particular, especially when you're a woman who's quite vocal or is an open book around it and is willing to kind of be David versus Goliath, or especially with like gambling industry, because it's a real like really big issue and raise awareness. Like having a lived experience voice is really worth something in this day and age because like I'll have people, like say offer me money to speak for half an hour about what it was like to be a gambling addict. And I know and I've got to sort of like, I have earned that money, you know what I mean?
yeah,
And don't get me wrong, it's not easy, but it's like, it's easier than being stuck playing roulette 12 hours a day. Plus, I would rather be doing that because it feels like honest money. It feels
mhm,
like like I can, if somebody comes to one of those seminars or an online talk or something and goes, oh, that's made me think about that, then if you're helping one person, then it's all for a reason. So it's just
yeah,
kind of like keeping that balance between doing that and it's quite serious stuff, and the creativity kind of like unblocks my mind a wee bit. It's like a pleasure to write a short story. I love writing the last word of a poem, knowing that it's got some mad message that somebody might like one day at an open mic or beyond that. That'll do me.
yeah. About connection, isn't it? And I
Yeah,
think you're
definitely.
smashing it when it comes to that, which is great. How do people get in touch with you? People want to connect. People want to kind of follow your journey. What's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so probably best place is on Instagram. I quite like a wee bit of Instagram. I kind of put like poetry stuff, gambling stuff on that. Just gambling recovery stuff, obviously. So it's Cat Cochrane _writer,
Cool.
and
I'll
there's
stick a wee
also
link in as well.
thank you, Scott. And then in regards to the podcast, I have a wee Instagram page for that. That's like No Dice, and it'll give the links to the episodes. I've currently just got it on Spotify, because now that way when you do a podcast, you just want to land it somewhere. But this year I'm hoping to have it on other platforms. I'm also doing a book at the moment called Glasgow Hairdressers and Barbers' Tales.
Okay.
Where, pardon the pun, but I'm cutting about Glasgow barbers' shops and salons getting their best story.
Love that.
And it's going to be published this summer, and it's turned into social documentation. It's turned into a story of an evolving Glasgow, because if you think there's a lot of life in bookies, there's a hell of a lot of life in hairdressers and barber salons, And if anybody knows a hairdresser or has a really good hairdressing story that they would like to include in the book, hit me up on Instagram, and I would happy to chat to it. So thank you.
Fantastic. Lots of good stuff going on, and storytelling absolutely the core of all of it. So huge thank you for doing this, Kat. I really do appreciate it. I think your story's incredible. I think I've got full admiration for the journey you've been on, what you're doing now. And highly recommend that people connect. I'll put links up to Ayla, to Gamblers Anonymous, to all of your stuff. Please people do get in touch with Kat and get out there and connect. Huge thank you. Catch up soon.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you this afternoon. Take care of yourself. Best.
Cheers, Kat.